Hello, everyone. Welcome to OrcaCon 2020, if this is the first panel or event that you've attended. If not, we're happy to already have you here. This is Charlatanry and Chicanery, Gamemastering on the fly, and this is a very exciting panel for all of us because here we reveal that the secret to being a good GM is being completely full of it. And we're only partially joking because a big secret to GMing is not necessarily anticipating every single thing that your players are going to do and having the perfect plot set out and having it all go on the rails. It is about creating a good gaming experience at the table for your players, rolling with the punches, and generally being able to craft a story through a lot of improvisation techniques that we'll talk about today. So before we do that, I would like to introduce myself and my esteemed fellow panelists here. My name is Amanda Harmon. I am the managing developer for the Starfinder RPG at Paizo. I've been a GM for a decade and a half at this point, worked on many games including Starfinder, Pathfinder, lots of other games from other publishers. And I really like running con games because creating a narrative for folks who get together without a lot of prior knowledge of each other and creating a game experience that's fun and cohesive for them is very enjoyable for me.
My name is Adam Davis. I'm a founder and executive director of the nonprofit organization Game to Grow, which runs therapeutic social skills groups for kids using Dungeons & Dragons. And so we play a lot of Dungeons & Dragons with kids in a way that helps them come out of their shell and make friends, sometimes for the first time. And that requires us to be very responsive to whatever ideas they put into the game. So we have had to adapt our model to be very improvisational. I also am a full-time executive director and have run 5 90-minute games a week on top of being a full-time executive director, and that means that I have to do very little planning. So I've learned to be very good at making stuff up on the fly.
I'm Lynne Hardy. I am the associate editor for Call of Cthulhu at Chaosium and now line editor for the Rivers of London RPG. So I'm kept out of mischief a lot by working on other people's stuff at the moment. And like Amanda, I love running convention games because I don't get to run an awful lot anywhere other than conventions these days, and it really does keep you on your toes and make you raise your level in terms of not knowing what people are going to throw at you. Because, okay, coming back to conventions on a repeat basis, you do start to get your little group and get used to people, but there's nothing quite like having a table full of strangers to really make you work hard and get your brain cells firing.
Hi, I'm Mike Robles. I am the team lead for the Xbox Reactive social media channels. Before that, I worked previously on Dungeons & Dragons and Magic the Gathering as the community manager for both analog and digital projects for Magic and D&D. And I love to play and run games specifically for newer players that haven't maybe touched a system before, because that way they're not used to a system and they can sort of ask me, can I do this, can I do that? And my response is usually, yeah, let's try it, we'll see what happens. I had been running a game for about 2 years with my wife, my mother-in-law, and 2 of my wife's best friends, which made for some, and the mother-in-law never touched Dungeons & Dragons before, so it made for very interesting experiences.
Well, as online I go by Diana Moon. In real life I am Carmen. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a freelancer for writing RPGs, and I have been a part of I Need Diverse Games Twitch channel as the Reclaimers. We're an all POC RPG group that we play on Sundays, and we rotate depending on the game on who's the GM, and we've been playing on Twitch for over about a year and a half now, and I've been playing a lot of like GM lists or GM full depending on how you like kind of games on the Gauntlet, which is an online community where there's games practically almost every day of the week, and I've played many of GM full type of games, and those have been really fun because without a GM you're making everything up as you go along.
Great, thank you guys. So what we're going to do is I have a couple of questions to pose to my panelists to give you all an idea of the types of GMs that we are and some of our philosophies about running these types of games. We'll talk about that for a few minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. So I will ask that you hold your questions until that time, if at all possible, and then we'll try to get everybody that we can in the remaining time that we have. So, first off, tell me and tell our audience here what sort of GM you are. What sort of games do you like to run? What kind of experience do you like to craft? What are some of your favorite games? All of these things are great, I think, for our audience to hear about. And we'll start with Adam.
I really underemphasize combat in the games that I play. It's harder for me to improvise combat. I can do a fine job of improvising combat, but most of the improv that I do and the games that I like to run have a lot of NPCs. I'm playing games mostly with teens and adolescents, so I have a lot of silly voices that I use, made up NPCs. My favorite NPC, I think, was Mordnap Nimbletoes, who is a gnome bard who played the pan flute and followed them around and talked like Mickey Mouse.
Oh my god.
And it was fun, and they hated him, and they shot him in the back with a crossbow. But then he came back as a ghost. Because I'm the game master.
That's right, and you do what you want, right, Adam? Lynn.
Oh, right. Well, I tend to veer between horror for Call of Cthulhu and steampunk pulp adventure, although on Halloween I finally did get to do my happy improvisation using Rory's Story Cubes and Untold Adventures Awaits with the Scooby-Doo set. So those of you who know Untold Adventures Awaits, it's you use Rory's Story Cubes to create a very structured story, because it's an introductory storytelling game aimed at families. So that was wonderful. So I go from everything from really scary horror to high-end silliness, quite often crossing over in the middle. I like to think I'm evil but fair as a GM, and I very much like to just see where the players will take me, because I believe we are all creating a story, and I am just there to moderate and guide it and build on their silliness and their ideas, and quite often they will come up with better ideas than me, and I will go for it. And yesterday was the classic in the Cthulhu game I was running. Someone went, "Oh damn, I shouldn't have just given you that idea, should I?" And it was like, "Yes, you should. Thank you."
And you had that idea the whole time, right?
Yes, of course, yes.
It's funny because I used to do improv down in Seattle at Pike Place Market for maybe about 5-7 years, and it was because I always said I couldn't act. So all of my games lead to every character I improvise is just like an extended version of me. So the kind of GM I am, I'm a trickster by nature, and so I've noticed as I get older, I tend to get a little bit more screwed up, as we all do. And so I've started leaning a lot more towards horror. I was running a 5th edition D&D campaign with my wife, mother-in-law, and her friends. Then we started Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition. I was lucky enough to get an advanced copy and test it and run it for a preview article I wrote. And so we got really into that. I love running Dread. If you've never played Dread, it is a horror RPG with a Jenga block. And so instead of rolling dice, you pull Jenga blocks, and I realized as I continue, I am more of the person that, I'm the GM, it's like, "Are you sure?" Like, "I want to do this." And I'll say, "Are you sure?" And they go, "Yeah, all right, let's see what happens," right? And we'll roll with it. I like to, especially in Vampire a lot lately, I want to make my players uncomfortable, but not to the point where they are like, I feel harassed or anything like that. But I want them to question whether or not they're doing things for the greater good or their greater good. And Dread has helped me with that a lot as well, because in Dread you ask a lot of very personal questions about their characters, and I make them dive deep into it. In fact, I have a Dread setting that I'm waiting to run where every player embodies one of the Sedley Devon sins, the 7 deadly sins. So all of their questions are really messed up questions, and half of them came back and were like, "I can't answer some of these yet, like I need to wait," or they need to like take a break from writing the questions. So I'm more of the I'm evil, kind of want to be fun, but just still evil.
I'm not a fan of combat for RPing and stuff, so I don't play or at least I wouldn't be GMing a D&D type game. I love playing D&D, but because I'm a fan of the players, and even with horror, you still want them to at least get to a point where they have no other choice but to die. I do like the GM full type of games where we kind of all collaborate. So I like the idea of painting the scene and having the players add to the storyline, and then I just riff off of them. Playing Girl Underground was one of the great ways to do that, was because you get them to answer questions, and you're like, okay, well that gives me an idea here and there. And I've realized I like playing silly games, because we played facilitated laser kittens, where you're just tiny baby kittens who have superpowers. Who the biggest bad would be the dreaded laundry being on, kind of thing. But then at the same time, I like to give weirdness to the worlds I'm setting. Like in the Girl Underground, the sea was glittery and it made a tinkling sound, even though when it went through your hands, it still was water. And I like giving them like aspects where they think it might be horror, but it's not a horror game at all. But like they'll start questions like, oh shit, what's going on there? Like, which it's just funny because I'm like, I didn't think of that, but now I'm going to add that kind of thing. So I like to keep the players on their toes, and not in a bad way or a gently good evil way. It's just like thinking more out of the box, and that's the kind of way I like to play when I jam.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I agree with everything that all my panelists have said here. And for myself, I think I really enjoy paying very close attention to what the players are talking about and what their strategies are, and really pulling threads out from that. And in some cases, I think one of the more difficult things for me when I was first starting out was when players would come up with a thread that I really didn't have any idea about it. I hadn't thought of it myself. I wasn't sure what I would do. Sometimes it's when they're latching onto NPCs that are just sort of there in the background. And one story that happened last year, this happened while I was streaming a game to promote 2nd edition Pathfinder. So there's, you know, an added level of pressure onto that. But I was running a module called Fair at Somberfell Hall, which is a horror module that is essentially a sort of like you have to survive in this mansion while zombies and undead things are assaulting in waves, and the PCs have to go to the mansion to find this professor and talk to him, and it turns out that the things that he's experimenting into unknowingly trigger these waves of zombies. But they start out in this little town, and they're supposed to learn more about the lore of the professor and the school that he's involved with, and get hints that his experimentations are a little bit strange. And they're doing all of these things, but they're really spending a lot of time in the tavern and talking about things that they want to buy and getting drinks and buying rounds for everybody. And I'm there in the background thinking, I'm running the stream, 15 minutes have already passed. I need to get them to Somberfell Hall so I can start some of these encounters. So I just throw an NPC in the corner who's a drunkard, who looks like he's sleeping. He's got a little bit of drool running down the side of his face. He's got his hat going on, and all of a sudden he hears them say the name of this professor, and he perks up and he kind of goes, I've heard of that guy. Oh, you don't want to mess with him. He lives all the way over there. I heard that he has all kinds of just treasures, and he hoards them, and trying to give them all kinds of things, you know, to prompt them to go out there. And I was hoping that they would go, oh, this guy, you know, he seems like he's onto something. We should go find this professor. And they did, but they got very into talking to this guy. And they wanted to know all about him and why he was there. And, you know, his persona was this blustery kind of drunk who thought he was very important. And he claimed to be the entertainer of the town, and they let him drink for free here, and which wasn't true. They basically just didn't throw him out of the town because the town guard had asked them to give him a place to be to not bother people on the street. So they latched onto this NPC, and this is a published adventure. This NPC doesn't exist. So I had to make up a name. I called him Bartle the Entertainer. They went back and forth with him. They did a bunch of diplomacy checks. They got to be friends with Bartle the Entertainer. Bartle the Entertainer started to herald their way down the path to Somberfell Hall, and it created this entire secondary subplot in which they wanted to protect their friend Bartle the Entertainer from all of these zombies. And the adventure was entirely different than what it would be if I would have just ran it out of the box and found, you know, some other way or some sort of railroady way to get them over there. But because I was paying attention to what they were doing and was not afraid to make up just something dumb on stream, that ended up being a really fun thing, and it generated a lot of comments and things online, and so that for me was a very fun experience, but is an example of trying to improv while you're jamming.
But that's a key thing, isn't it? Listen to your players, because they will tell you what they're interested in and where they want to go. And as we've hinted at, quite often that may well be better than the plot you thought you had.
Yeah.
But if you work with them, it will often give rise to amazing extra stories and added depth that you had no idea you were going to get. And it's very enriching then for you and them. Because the whole point is that sometimes as GMs we forget we're supposed to be having fun with this too. And it's okay as a GM to have fun. And if you're not having fun, maybe
Yeah.
think about altering your strategy a little bit.
It should be more fun.
Having fun too.
It should be more fun than stressful, absolutely. So that leads into my next question for the panelists here, which is that players do crazy things. They come up with all kinds of ideas. What are some of your strategies and some ways that you have dealt with that? Maybe some things that you can mentally prepare ahead of time for what you don't know. We'll start down with Carmen again.
Because I play with the same group of people weekly for I Need Diverse Games, we're all technically writers, like story writers, so we come up with the most crazy ideas or out there ideas. Like one time for Girl Underground, you're given different adventure paths and you take them to different locations, and so I took them to this location where it's someone who's hoarding like a lot of different ancient artifacts in this Baba Yaga-like tomb, because it's a tomb on bird legs. And they decided like, oh, well, we don't want to go in there. And the guy who owns this, he's controlling all the animals to help them. And so they convinced the animals to form a union and to run away. So this whole adventure path that I was going to have them go on was now not available, because it's like, well, they rolled really well. They convinced the Baba Yaga tomb to just fly away, because the main guy can't fly, despite him being a bird-like character. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, luckily I had prepared in advance. Well, here are the different locations we'll try to go to. Maybe we'll get there in 2 hours. I was like, well, we're going to this location very soon. So if your game is more of like a typical adventure fantasy game where they're going to different locations, just have like 1 or 2 things prepared in case they decide to ignore the big main location and want to go off on a side quest, because that's what's fun about free roaming RPGs. You just want to do all the side quests first. Like, forget the main story. It's all about the little things. So I would recommend just have a couple just bullet points of like, in case they decide not to do that thing for very good story reasons, yeah.
I have what I call the GM sigh, where somebody will be like, I want to do this, and all right, because it happens. I have 2 very clear instances. I can't stress this enough, and Carmen's already hit it on the head. Like, have bullet points ready. I remember my first night before I ran my first 5th edition D&D game. I was up till 4 a.m. I had everything plotted out. Now it's like, oh, I got D&D in 30 minutes. Let's figure out what I got to do. It's like, that's the difference in GMing, when you are ready and you know your players are just going to go crazy. We had this adventure with the D&D campaign where they were supposed to go and take on this tower or this castle with a bunch of like really high powerful creatures in it, and I was super excited. I was like, oh, we're gonna get super crunchy in this episode. They're all gonna get to show off their fighting skills. They're all really excited. And then some in the group decided they wanted to befriend and basically grab all the minions and make the minions their army. So they just sent the minions in there, and it became an RTS strategy game all of a sudden, where it's like, all right, 4 minions died, these things died. They stayed outside the entire time while they sent their army in to go do all the work. And I was like, cool, you walk in and get the treasure. All right, let's move on. In our vampire game, we had a character that was she was freshly sired, not really sure what was happening, and my group decided they want to take her to a club. And in the club, she was getting harassed by some dudes, because it's a club. And then one of the vampires decided they were going to push the guy back, push him away. They accidentally sliced his throat, which of course caused the freshly sired vampire to lose it, which created this giant frenzy that nobody was prepared for. And I had to have, there's supposed to be like this huge, powerful person to come down much later on, but now I had an excuse to like introduce this person much sooner than I anticipated. Because you never know what's going to happen. Have things ready, have bullet points ready, have the skeleton, and let the players fill out the guts. You got to get from point A to point B. How you're going to get there, it's going to be completely up to your players. But just be ready for literally anything, which is a hard thing to do when you don't know what anything could be.
Yeah. Certainly, obviously with Call of Cthulhu, I tend to run a lot of investigative type games rather than necessarily fighty games. So it's just be prepared to shift your clues.
Yeah.
Don't have them fixed to one particular person or one location, because you can pretty much guarantee the players will head off in entirely the opposite direction to the one you're expecting. So have the information that they need to find so that it can move. But it looks natural when they stumble across it. Mm-hmm. So it's the analogy we were talking about beforehand is like the story is gliding along perfectly smoothly like a graceful swan, while underneath your little GM brain is doing this to keep that going. So yes, just be flexible where your clues can be found and who they can be found with.
There are lots of times that players will do something you don't expect, and what I always ask myself is, what's the worst that could happen if I said yes? And most of the time it's not that bad. And oftentimes it's because they're interested in something that I'm not interested in. I had a game where my plot, and we actually wrote this into a Kickstarter that we made, the Age of Green plot, where the world is being taken over by plants. This age-old time where plants took over the world before dragons took over the world. It was a really interesting thing that I loved making up the story. My players did not care about it at all. And so they had to go find this dragon, because the dragons, whole world building thing where the dragons knew how to stop the Age of Green from coming back, and the players went and they discovered that they can find where a dragon is nesting because dragons are attacking. Cool, they went to this town and decided that they were gonna start buying up all the houses because people were moving away because there was a dragon. So they started a real estate empire. And they went around and they literally went door to door saying, there's a dragon around, right? It's probably a good time to move. And they were buying up houses and trying to basically flip them. I mean, we're in Seattle, so real estate is a part of our lives. But in this moment, I was like, okay, well, they don't care about the dragon or the Age of Green or any of that stuff. Cool story, but they didn't care about it. So then they basically started a business. And then I had this rival real estate gang show up and be like, what are you doing in our town? This is our real estate town. And then there was a battle because of bringing a little bit of combat. And they ended up starting a cruise line.
As you do.
As you do. And it was like, what's the worst that could happen? So I like I said before, I work with kids who have social setbacks for some reason or another, and my players were really gung-ho. They co-named the company together. They worked together. My cleric was making food and drink as hors d'oeuvres for people coming to look at these houses, and they were all working together. So that's what we want. What we want is our players to be enthusiastic about the thing that we're doing, and if that's not the thing that I was originally planning, then who cares? We're doing this to play. We're doing this to enjoy each other's company. So if that's a real estate empire and a cruise line, let's do it.
If I can add something, I know it's difficult when you're playing con games because you're generally playing with strangers, but if you do have a typical group that you're playing with, know your players. With my group, we all like to fight injustice in real life, and so we kind of want to do that. So almost everything was there was another scenario where this octopus was being very friendly with everybody. It was oh no, you're not allowed to touch without consent, even though you're being friendly. And so what was supposed to be a nice long episode of doing a masquerade and trying to find out the secrets, it was, no, we're burning this down. And they literally burnt down the ball because it was all these toxic masculinity. It's okay, I got to remember with this group, they're not going to stand, because other groups will be they'll let it go, go with the flow just to find out later on. But no, as soon as they found some injustice, they were we're not gonna let this stand. So, and then when I'm the player and someone else at the is oh, we know Carmen's gonna flirt with anybody, so make sure that they don't have all the plot. And I completely derailed a Lacuna game because I flirted with the wrong person.
It's really funny. In my D&D game, there are no woodland creatures at all anymore, because I know that anytime there's any sort of woodland creatures, one of my players will be I want to talk to that creature. I'm no, they're all gone.
And then they'll spend 30 minutes derailing the session trying to make it their pet.
Well, so then there's one time they're all gone. They're okay, well, I want to talk to the trees to figure out where they went. And I'm no. The trees are all scared to tell you any information.
I would say that's terrible and have to deal with, but I did that as a player myself with a taxidermied squirrel once. So I have sympathy for your players in that situation.
But Carmen raises a very good point. I mean, we're talking a lot about if you don't know what's going to happen, but if you do have a group and you know them really well, you can exploit knowing which buttons to push. And don't be afraid to do that either, because that can really make for some great stories. So if they are heading off in a direction you weren't expecting and you know what buttons to push, go for it.
Push those buttons, my friends.
Yeah. You can also lure them back, more or less. So my cruise line company they were taking their tourists to this ancient island of ruins, which just so happened to be an ancient city of dwarves who used to fight the Age of Green. So it was just perfect.
That's very cool.
How weird. This is
15 minutes. I I think personally when dealing with the crazy things that players do or the wild ideas that they get, one thing that I have learned through experience is to not let, unless I'm playing in an organized play environment, to not let the rules really hinder what it is that I can allow them to do. And especially like knowing your players is a thing, and just being mentally prepared about like, well, Thirsty sure is going to do this thing, and when he does, this is how I'm going to respond to it. And oftentimes there's a layering of kind of trolling each other that can be brought into knowing your players in that case.
Building off that, sorry to interrupt, but building off that, you talk about like the rules. There are some GMs that I know that are very like the dice rule. No matter what happens, the dice rules. I fudge my dice all the time if it's going to make for a better story. If the players are going to, this is something you need to be prepared to do. Don't let the rules control your game. You and your players control the game. Don't let the dice or the Jenga blocks. I mean, Jenga blocks. If the tower falls in dread, yeah, you're dead, right? But like, if you're playing a game that uses any sort of specific dice, if it's going to make for a better story to fudge a roll, do it. I've done it so many times because I think the story will just end up being better. The players will be a little bit better. If one of my players is about to do like the final hit on this 1 HP boss that's left and they miss, or they roll slightly underneath, I'll just give it to them because it'll make, it's that player's moment to shine.
Yeah, absolutely. Creative interpretation of the rules and resolution mechanics and things like that is very helpful when it comes to GMing. For example, Mike, I'm going to tell a story about a game that you mentioned called Dread, which is a favorite horror rules of light sort of RPG that uses the Jenga tower and pulling bricks as skill checks, essentially. If you try to do something difficult, the GM says pull a brick. Sometimes they'll say pull 2 bricks or 3 bricks, depending on how crazy the thing is you're trying to do. I was running a con game last year, and I had a bunch of friends after hours in this little homebrew scenario that I had that was a post-Civil War era trek through a woods where there was sort of a Frankenstein thing going on, and they were stumbling across something that led to sort of like a flesh a golem kind of fabrication situation happening. Set in that time period, very atmospheric, and one of my players had filled out his character sheet before the game, and he said he was playing the like attendant character, and one of the questions is like, what is the one thing that you've kept with you to make you feel safe since your time in the service? What is the thing that you would never leave the house with, and all of that? And he just totally leaned into my cannon. And he filled out all of the questions about how he brought his cannon with him everywhere, and it was always in the back of the wagon, and he was the driver of the wagon, and it's like, you know what, he really wants to do this, I'm just gonna let him, and we're gonna see what happens. First time, things start to go down in this scenario in which, the wagon crashes, the wheel is broken, the horses run off, there is some strange sort of noises in the distance, and some of the party goes off to investigate. He sits back and says, I'm not leaving my cannon. Sits in the wagon. Zombies come out of an open grave. There's that going on, and it gets to his turn, and it's like, Thirsty, what's your driver doing? What are you doing in this? And he's like, I'm getting my cannon out and I'm putting it at zombies. And it's like, you do realize the rest of the PCs are right there with the zombies. He's like, yep, I'll just yell. I'll yell to warn them, and they'll get out of the way, and it'll be fine. And that's like, and the players are like, what are you doing? We're gonna get killed. He's like, nope, just get out of the way. And he lights the fuse, and he shoots the cannon at the zombies in the PCs. That happens. Everybody happens to dive out of the way. It does sort of like end that particular minor threat, which is again at the very beginning of the scenario. And that leads to an encounter later on in which the carpenter character confronts the driver character and says, you almost killed us. And they're kind of going at it. And at one point then the driver character, who is this veteran, says, I'm gonna draw out my knife. I'm gonna draw out my tactical knife, and I'm gonna tell him that if he doesn't like the way I do things, that he can leave or he can meet my knife up close and personal. And it's like, you're not supposed to do PvP in this game. That's not how this goes. But you know what? Then they just played into it, and the carpenter character is like, I've got a 2x4 that I was going to use to try to fix this wheel, and you know what? I just let them do PvP, and I let them start pulling, and they're pulling, and at the end, the Thirsty just knocks over, the driver character just knocks over the tower and says, I'm going to like run at him and just, I don't care if I die, I'm going to make myself known, I'm going to go out in a blaze of glory. And it's like, okay, well, the way I resolved that is that he sure does die because he rushed himself at this other character, but he is able to blind the Carpenter character because he chose, to have that tower fall. So the rest of the game went through with no driver character and a Carpenter who was blind, which was a really interesting proposition when a whole bunch of zombies started coming out and they're trying to figure out this thing. So that game was not supposed to have PvP. The rules are not supposed to allow PvP. But because they were all super into it and everybody was kind of cheering them on and there were spectators coming to that game because we were in a lobby of a hotel, it's just like, I'm not gonna say no, you can't do that. We're just gonna see where this goes.
Yeah. And sometimes it's what everyone's been saying, is like the rules are there in service of the story. Go where the story's leading you, and just the rules can go by the by. And it's always hilarious though, working officially for companies, I don't know whether you found this, is that if you don't use the rules as written, sometimes people are really shocked.
Yeah.
You work for this company.
They think you're the rules
police,
police,
and it's
right?
like, yeah. I only have to worry about that when I'm writing official scenarios and editing other people's. When I'm playing, it's like, is this serving the story?
Yes.
Yes, no. Okay, no, forget about it.
That's very much a thing that I think is important to express if that's your style of jamming, as a professional, that there's no wrong, bad fun. And even though I work for Paizo, you're playing Pathfinder or Starfinder, and you change the rules a little bit, or you flub something, nobody's gonna come to your house and take your books and tell you that you're bad and that you're wrong. If your game is still fun and your players are having a good time, then that's perfect. That's exactly what we want. So you don't need to feel hemmed in by the way the rules work or the way the adventure is written or the fact that you don't like some of the NPCs. Just change that. You are the GM and you have all of the agency in the world when it comes to that. So I think right now we'll go ahead and open up for some questions if anybody has anything. Any questions for us? If not, we're just going to keep telling weird stories. Yes, ma'am, back there.
What have been some things, like obstacles or difficulties that you've run into early on in your GM career, and how have you overcome them?
That's a great question. Would anybody like to tackle that one?
Are you going to repeat it for the camera?
Oh, yes, so the question, thank you, Lynn. The question is, what are some challenges that we experienced early in our GMing career, and how did we work to resolve those? Yes. Okay.
I can start. I know for me, I was in my head a lot when I started as a GM, because I was like, this is what I want to have happen. Like, this needs to happen. We have to follow these rules. We have to do that. And that is, like, for me, that is the biggest obstacle, I think, with any new GM. And that's just understanding that your players will eventually get there. What you may think is supposed to happen in one session may take 2 or 3, but the more you learn about your players, whether it's a one-off or whether it's an ongoing game, eventually your players will find that they'll get there. Railroading can make it very unfun. I've heard stories from other people about how they had GMs that were like, they just made me do this. We wanted to talk to all these other people, and the GM was like, every NPC had the exact same rules, and then claimed that like a wizard had taken over the tavern and cursed everyone to only say the same things over and over again, which was boring and not fun. So for me, I think one of the biggest obstacles is just getting out of your head and knowing that everyone's gonna have fun, you're there to have fun, and eventually you'll get there.
But there is also a difference. I mean, people quite often confuse, you can have a linear plot, there's nothing wrong with having a linear plot, but there is a difference between a linear plot and railroading.
Right.
Yes.
You know, so it can be straightforward from A to B, they can wibble about getting there, but you're not forcing them to get there, and they will get there eventually, as Mike says. But don't be afraid of linear plots.
Right.
Because I know sometimes people kind of confuse the two. The main one I started playing when I went to university through the Seattle Seahawks, but that's a different story. And I started GMing very soon after I started playing, because the group that I was adopted into were very experienced, but they'd not played D&D for a long time. So I was handed a red box within a couple of weeks of actually just starting role-playing altogether and told, you're running this. Which was great, and I enjoyed it to an extent, but I didn't, because they'd all been playing since they were kids, I didn't feel like I could challenge them. I didn't feel like I was getting much out of it, and I couldn't surprise them. So I changed systems. I went with Talazanto, and they knew nothing about that, so I could pull any old nonsense. And that really freed me up, because I felt I wasn't attempting to recreate their childhood experience for them, which was really rather daunting as a new player and a new GM.
It's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
I have a couple of ones, especially if you like it's your first few times GMing. Don't split the party at the beginning.
Oh my gosh.
My first GM experience was in high school. They handed me, hey, there's a Sailor Moon RPG out. You're into Sailor Moon. We want to play Sailor Moon. I'm like, fantastic. And I had half the party be Negaverse characters and half the party be about to be awakened Sailor Senshi characters. And so that was not like being my first time and like, okay, not knowing how to merge, and half the time people are just sitting, not paying attention to the other half. As a beginner GM, do not do that. Like if you're more advanced, don't do it either if you can help it, but sometimes that's how the plot will go. Also, it's still a little bit of a problem, but one of the barriers that took me a long time to go back into GM, because after that one, I didn't GM until like about a couple of years ago. Because I was always just like, oh, we need to have all this storyline, we need to have all this plotted out and everything. And it's not because the players are going to derail it, it's just like, what happens if they derail it and then you're stuck? So you're already pre-blocking yourself into worrying. So I would suggest playing maybe GM-less games or ones where you're facilitators, so that you start getting into that role of like being a little bit more improvisational. In that way, especially if you can't afford to take an improvisation class, because I know a lot of GMs like to take those kinds of classes. Just do GM-less types of games where you're all collaborative and you learn to experience that, so that you get over that. And then I had a third point and I already forgot. I'll get back to it if any.
My advice would be, don't try to play somebody else's game. It's your game, and there's no reason to try to play Matt Mercer's game or Jerry Holkins' game or anybody else's game. It's yours. When I first started playing, I was trying to play in the style of the game masters who I played with, and they were much more ruthless, much more combat oriented, and I was trying to be ruthless and combat oriented. Anybody who knows me knows like that's just not me, as evidenced in my Mord Not Nimbletoes story. So I was actually running a module. I was running a module because I didn't have time to plan, and this was before I was comfortable improvising, and so I grabbed a module, and I didn't plan, so I didn't read ahead in the module, which is another problem. I was trying to run the module on the fly, and then there was like a breeding chamber or something like that in there, and I was running a game for kids, and there was like aliens who had kidnapped people and were doing like forced impregnation or something, and I was like, well, this room is empty. Weird. I wonder what's in the next room.
There's a pony and a unicorn.
Yeah.
Rainbows, sparkles.
Yeah, there's some drawings on the wall. Cool. And I just had to make it up right in that moment. So I think from that moment forward, I decided I couldn't trust anybody else's material to be the game that I wanted it to be. So I think that's the main advice that I always give for new game masters, based on my experience, is make it your own. And that's, you know, if you like silly NPCs, make it a silly NPC game. Of course, know your players and make sure that's the game they want to play.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, making it your own is one of the most important pieces of advice I would give.
Yeah, I'd say that an advice that I would have based on my personal experience going back when I first started GMing is to just be kind to yourself. And I mean that in a couple of different ways. I mean be kind to yourself in a mental sense of I was always trying to be perfect. I was, you know, trying to read the module, you know, very, very closely, or, you know, I did mostly homebrew early on, and so I was doing reams and reams of notes of the story and all of the NPCs, and it's like, well, if they decide to go into the cheesemonger, then I really need to have an NPC who's a cheesemonger, and what's their name, and where are they from, and what's their daughter like, and all that stuff. And of course, a lot of that stuff never comes up, and as we've discussed on this panel, players will go in all of these directions that you just can't predict. And so being kind to yourself is understanding that there will be things that come up that you didn't predict, and instead of really letting that kind of stress you out and feel the pressure of that, just reorganizing your mind to see that as an opportunity to do something more fun that does make it more of a game that you want to run. And, you know, well, what do you think that the NPCs should find when they open a door that you never expected that they were going to? What are they going to find? And then that can lead to the real sorts of group storytelling that is much more fulfilling for GMs and for players at the same time. Making sure, like Lynne mentioned, that you're having fun when you're the GM is very paramount, and is certainly much more important than trying to be perfect or making sure that you resolved every skill check, you know, exactly perfectly and did all of the math right. We all fudge dice. We talked about that a little bit. It is about the experience and not about trying to come up to somebody else's standards or try to be what you think is perfect or not mess up anything. Understanding that you're in it with the players and the players aren't expecting you to be perfect is a good piece of advice, I think, for early on. Take the pressure off of yourself.
And at the end of the day as well, if you really are stumped and your brain has just completely blanked on you, just say, could we have a 5-minute break?
Yeah.
Could I just have 5-10 minutes to just gather my thoughts, go and, you know, change pace for a couple of seconds, put the kettle on, have a cup of tea, coffee obviously if you're American.
My players like tea.
I like your players. You know, so you know, you're human. Your players have to accept that. I mean, we all like to think that we are superhuman GMs, but it's just not necessarily true. We are all human, and there is nothing wrong with just going, guys, people, everyone, unicorns, I need 5 minutes just to gather my thoughts, and then we can get going again.
Yep.
One of the reasons I love Dread so much is because they tell you, after each act, you know, Dread can be done in acts. After each act, take 5 minutes. And then everyone comes back, you get out of the game for a little bit, you come back, you say, let's recap what's happened, you talk about the story, and then you get back into it. That's a nice thing also about Dread. If the tower falls, you've got that nice little, you know, 3-4 minutes while you're rebuilding the block and then removing the pieces, and sort of, it's gonna really help you like refresh. In Vampire, we take breaks almost every 30 minutes. You know, also because Vampire deals with a lot of heavy stuff, and depending on what's happening in the story, we may need those, you know, need that 5-10 minutes after, you know, doing some really heavy stuff or heavy talking about. I run a lot of horror games, and so we take breaks pretty constantly because, you know, we deal with a lot of spooky stuff or stuff that may make somebody feel uncomfortable or, you know, get in their head a little bit. If you ever played 10 Candles or heard of 10 Candles, that is a game.
It's hardcore though.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. And that is one where it's, you know, you need that moment.
Yeah, particularly if you're playing it. I mean, I told this story last year, so if anybody remembers this one, we actually played 10 Candles in the beer cellar of a German Schloss.
That is amazing.
In October,
Lynne's
in the dark.
European, y'all.
And you could hear the mice, actual real mice, scrabbling away in the corner. That was really freaky. And it was also the coldest I've ever been in my life. We were all huddled under blankets. So that's kind of going a bit far in terms of setting the atmosphere. But yeah, we were all, when we all got out of there, it was like daylight warmth. Well, it wasn't daylight, but it was kind of like light warmth. Yay! So yeah, you know. If it's getting, as Mike said, you just take a break. If you and your players need it, go take that break just to lighten things up so you can come back at it full on.
Yeah, and we'll talk about this a little bit more because it's very applicable to horror games in a panel at 1 o'clock that a lot of us are sitting on, that I will also be moderating. But having a session 0 is also very helpful.
That was my third point. That was my third point.
Which is something that is somewhat of a new concept. I wasn't aware of it, at least when I was first getting started about GMing, but it can be anything from, you know, having like an email conversation or Discord chat to actually getting together, and your first session might involve character creation, or it might just be discussing what sorts of game do folks want to play, what are folks comfortable with, is there anything you're not comfortable with, and really just getting on the same page.
Using a safety toolkit like Lines of Veils or like whatever, if you want to use the X card. So like not just for horror, for any game, because you can be triggered by anything in your personal, and no one, as a GM, you don't know what will trigger your players or offset. It could be some, like I realized recently that a lot of people who are like mothers or parents, they don't want to have to do with, even if offhand, they don't want to have a story that has to do with a child in peril. And it's like, okay, that's something, as someone who's not a parent, like I would have never because in most horror shows, the children are the ones in peril, so it's like, okay, you got to balance that. Or it could be like, for me recently, in any games I play, is like nothing to do with grandparent grief or having to take care, and that's something minor with other people, like it wouldn't be a big deal, but for others, and so a session 0, especially when you're a new GM, because then you can set, like, are we going to do rules, because some players are going to be I only play by the rules, I don't care, this is a homebrew setting, we're going by the original core book, and you need to know that as a GM ahead of time, because otherwise you'll get frustrated mid-game. A friend of mine was doing this cool mechanic for a D&D game where as we're going through this like poisonous caves, randomly we'd be told to roll a die for Constitution to see. But a couple of the other players were like, no, we want to do this. We want to know why. And he didn't want to tell a story, which made sense. Like, you don't want to know why you have to roll this but there were various like, no, we need to know so we can like do our checks or whatever. It's like, okay. But if you don't have that session 0 where you don't know if your players are like that kind of thing, and then that way it makes it easier as a GM to prep and everything.
Exactly, yes. Do we have any other questions from the audience? I saw, do you both have one question? Different questions. Okay.
You have to both ask the questions at the same time.
Yes. Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3.
It's improv.
Yes, we'll start on the outside there, please.
So my question was, how do you handle having multiple players who want to do different things and balancing attention? I've been in, like, especially Call of Cthulhu games, I've played that quite a bit at cons where it'll feel like a player's being ignored, or they can't do anything, or they can't be active and involved even if they want to be.
Right.
And so how do you personally learn to handle that?
Well, so the question is, how do you balance a player who wants to do everything and always have all the spotlight with the players who aren't necessarily as assertive? That's correct, the question? Yeah, so that's a great question. I think that on the side of the players who aren't as assertive, or maybe they're not getting to do as much stuff as the player who's, min-max their character and they're doing all the damage and they're always getting the killing blows. We've all played with players of all sorts of philosophies, and there's usually one at every table who does that. Me as the GM, I will very much pay attention to folks' engagement level at the table, and if there is a person or another person who's not getting as much limelight, who's sort of disengaging from what's happening at the table, I keep copies of character sheets in front of me, and I'll look at that character sheet and I'll bring in something that's specifically aimed toward that character. And usually when that happens, I'll see kind of their eyes light up and they'll get a little bit more excited, and they're instantly more invested when there's an item that's tied to the character's parents, if it's important, if that's an important part of their background, or there's some kind of event that has happened that triggered them to become the class that they are, or whatever. I always have players talk about their characters' backgrounds in that way, so that I can bring those little threads in, and then that might just be a little thing that happens right there, and then it kind of comes back in different threads throughout play, or it might be something that the other players also kind of glom onto, and then we go in that direction for the session, and that can really just reroute basically the pacing and can prevent one character from taking over all of the spotlight without just explicitly saying, stop hogging the spotlight, because that's sort of an elegant way to do it. It's not that you can't do that, but there's ways to make that a little bit more streamlined.
And certainly with Call of Cthulhu, when I do convention games, I provide pre-gens. And I always try to make sure that the pre-gens have unique skills that each one of them will play into the plot at some point, so that there is always going to be a point. But Amanda's right. You kind of, it's one of the skills you kind of have to learn and keep an eye on, is levels of engagement and encouraging people in to the plot by knowing roughly what they've got. Session zeros are great for this, because if you use a session 0 to create characters and you're there while they're creating them, you are getting those points that Amanda's mentioned that you can then use to draw them in and make sure that there's something there for everybody to keep them interested, that everybody can contribute to. But there are going to be sessions when people are tired, they're not on top of their game, they're not necessarily wanting to be deeply involved. They're quite happy maybe just sitting back and letting other people take the spotlight. And again, that's something you kind of have to learn, and that's easier with a group of people that you play with regularly than it is with convention things. And they're kind of almost, it's something that comes a lot with experience. And don't be afraid if you don't get it straight away. That will come with time.
What easy trick, have a checklist. Here are my players, I give them an opportunity for a spotlight, and if you know something to give them a spotlight, then that makes it really easy. I use a lot of, I do this and pretend like I'm a camera person, and I say, okay, well that continues to happen. My super highly engaged players, I'll be like, great, this conversation continues, off screen. Camera cuts over. What is your character doing?
Yeah, exactly. And just prompting them.
They might say well, my character's sitting by the campfire. Oh, what are they doing by the campfire?
What are they thinking?
They're whittling by the campfire. Oh, now we know something about your character. What is the look on their face as they're whittling? Are they annoyed by this rambunctious conversation that's happening? Or are they having a nice reflective moment? So I can make that character not have to play out anything. They just kind of like have a moment, and I literally do it like a TV show. And that happens off screen is a great way to like let them feel like their characters are doing something. I don't have to tell them to stop, but if they're having an argument that's not going anywhere, cool. Those characters continue to argue. You guys are gonna have to come up with what the resolution is, but we don't want to watch it. And this is now let's have a moment where I can highlight another player who doesn't have to be creative. They don't really have to do very much. It's just about recognizing that they're also at the table.
So we'll go on to questions because we only have 10 to 15 minutes left. We've got one there. I saw a hand there, and we'll just keep going until we run out of time. What you got?
So what do you do when you have a party who's hook shy for a main plot line, and you can only do so many side quests?
What do you mean by hook shy?
Like, you're trying to get like a main linear plot line in. Like, all right, so this is the big story. I'm giving you 8 options, and I'm a duck.
They don't like.
Okay, so the question is what happens when you lay all sorts of hints about the plot and the players are just not interested and they want to do their own thing. Okay?
Let them do their own thing. They're telling you what they're interested in. Let them go do that.
You can drop hints of the story in each side quest, like, you know, maybe somebody drops a broken piece of something, right? And you're like, oh, then every time you find a new side quest, you find another piece, and eventually you put together this puzzle, and all of a sudden you're like, hey, what's this puzzle mean? Oh, this is more of the side quest, or this is more of the main quest. There's a bunch of different ways you can do it. Lynn's right? That's what they want to do. Let them do it for a while. Eventually, at some point, they're going to start realizing, and you as a GM will need to start sprinkling little bits of the main story in the side quest. Instead of one big major movie, you're going to just sprinkle little bits in. Steven Universe does a great job, actually, where as you're watching the show, the more you watch, you're like, oh, this was mentioned previously. They're really good at breadcrumbing, and that's what you might have to eventually start doing.
Just start giving like those NPCs and those side quests backstories that connect to the main thing. Like in the Girl Underground story that was originally supposed to be 2 sessions became an 8-session thing because I kept introducing NPCs that were constructs, and one of the players was a construct who was the last of their kind. So they glommed on to, like, oh, so I would have those new NPCs mention something of the main plot. And then, because they kept wanting to pick up every clue, even if it was like a throwaway clue, they're like, no, we want to go explore that. So then just have them keep mentioning this big thing. So one of the big things, there's a mystical dragon. It's like, oh, well, I heard stories about this dragon, and it's like, oh, well, where do we go? And so yeah, you just have to, like you said, break down that main plot and give it to those. And even if they do all the side quests, eventually there's going to be so much of these puzzle pieces, like, okay, we really actually need to focus on the dragon. We can't go find your lost love interest right now. We'll get back to that, but maybe the dragon will help with that side quest of the love interest.
Make it a literal puzzle. You can go to a craft store and buy a puzzle. So I've started, as the more I play, I start introducing physical props at times. Make it a literal puzzle, right? And you're like, oh, the guy dropped this. Great, it was a puzzle piece. And then as they continue, all of a sudden, the puzzle becomes a map, which leads them to where they need to go. Just find ways. As a GM, it's going to be really hard if your players only want to do side quests, and you're going to get burnt out. You need to make it fun for yourself as well, and finding different ways by introducing something physical, dropping clues, even checklists, right? Like Adam's mentioned, just figure out ways to do that. That way you're having just as much fun as they're having.
You might have to break an NPC that was a major part of your story into 3 different NPCs, smaller, with different pieces.
That's great advice. Yeah, that's very cool. We had another question back there, I believe.
So how would you run a campaign with a dauntingly large number of players? Because way more people have responded to campaign invitations favorably than I expected recently, and I'm not sure what to do.
That's a good problem to have players wanting to.
So the question, just to repeat, is how do you deal as a GM with a very, very large group when you have a lot of people who want to play? A very quick response to that, and I have learned this the hard way a few times, is you have to limit the spots in your game. It's just too hard to try to play a game with, I believe there was 9 in this time that I'm thinking of many, many years ago, and I wasn't even playing, but the GM ended up trying to do 2 separate parties, and one of them was on a boat and the other one was in a cave, and he was running 2 fights at the same time, and we were basically going an hour between people's turns. And that is just not an enjoyable experience really for anyone. So as difficult as it might be, the first come, first served is something I would suggest. Cap it at whatever you're comfortable with, 5 or 6 or whatever, and just say we'll get you in the next time for the other folks.
So
if somebody drops out, we'll let you know.
I know a guy who's done this, and I want to do this at some point in the future. He had that problem, so he ran 2 sessions a week at different times, but they were both in the same world, and neither party knew that their actions had effects on the other world.
That's pretty cool.
And his plan is to one day bring both parties together in some massive battle and make it like an all-day event. And I was like, I want to do that. It's going to drain me. But that would be super amazing. But that's how I know one guy has handled it. 2 separate parties, same world, both interactions have consequences on the other's thing, and then they're slowly coming together to a giant, Avengers versus X-Men type deal.
That sounds so cool.
Right?
But also exhausting.
I did something similar to that, to build on that, with a co-GM. So another way to do it is to have a co-GM. So I run social skills groups, and the other facilitator was Adam Johns, the other Adam in Game to Grow. And we had 2 tables working in the same world, where there was a Lich King and a Lich Queen who, like, the ancient prophecy was they were going to be traveling towards each other, and when they kiss, the world ends. Something like that. And his group went after, like, the eastern castle, and my group went after the western castle, and then there was a magical item that let them send messages to each other. So there was a little bit of, like, impact on each other's world, but really they were both just trying to accomplish the same mission. We had to make sure we weren't using the same, like, puzzles, so they wouldn't tell each other, it's under the chair. But we had, like, a magic mirror that let them communicate, so we, like, sort of orchestrated the actual communication between the 2 parties at times. There's ways to do that creatively where everyone gets to play. You might need another game master for that, or have the 2 groups in the same world, like you were saying, where they're in the same world, they're not at the same time, but if you can find 2 days a week to do it, that might also work.
Yeah, don't burn yourself out though.
Because you will find there is a number that you are comfortable running with. It may be 3 people, maybe 2, maybe 4, maybe 6. 6 is usually kind of the upper limit, sensibly speaking, because after 6, just getting time for everybody to contribute becomes tricky. I once ran a demo game with 13 people, largely because, it wasn't by choice. The organizer of the event suddenly turned up with a whole load more people to the table because it was the last session of the weekend on a Sunday afternoon, and they kind of like, they wanted to have their go, and it was like, well, I can't really say no because the organisers just turned up with them. Never again. Trying to do an hour's demo with 13 people, 2 of whom suddenly decide they're going to be murder hobos and just try and kill all the other players. And thankfully, the rest of the players, the other 11 players, just went, no, we're not having this, and jumped on them. Not physically, I hasten to add, but sort of like in character, shut them down completely. But yeah, trying to do an hour's game with 13 people is a big, big no-no, and it's not fun.
There's another suggestion that I have briefly, and this doesn't always work for everybody, but it's a little bit more viable in a convention setting, or maybe a group of very close friends, or if you've got folks who, are really close or who are couples. Sometimes having 2 people play 1 character can be kind of fun. I've done that a few times at conventions. It does work better kind of for the one-shots, but just talk to them and see if they're willing, if that's something you're willing to do. It can be really interesting to see 2 players almost be, sort of the yin and the yang, or competing parts of a character's psyche. That can be a very cool thing to play into.
I've had, Rich ran Game of Cogs here a few years ago, and we had a parent and their child. They played the same character because the child was quite young and wasn't entirely sure. So Mum was there to help out. And the 2 of them together played the mechanical tiger, which was really
that's
cool.
Awesome. Yeah, I run a lot of Starfinder demos that shows their acquisition demos for folks who don't know anything about the game, and specifically at UK Games Expo, I have a lot of folks who bring their parent and they bring their young child and they sit them on the lap and they ask the child, what does he want to do? He says, I want to attack with my giant laser sword, and the parent will resolve it mechanically for them. But that can be a very fun way to approach that, but everybody has to be on board because it can kind of quickly get a little bit unwieldy.
That did lead to, at Kraken, the German convention, last year, the greatest line I've ever heard uttered in a game by a player was, please don't arm the baby with the metal die.
That's pretty good.
They then gave them a D30, which was kind of, I'm thinking, in terms of collateral damage, it's not going to be a great deal different, but I appreciate your sentiment.
So we've got time for one more quick question, if anybody has anything for us. Yes, right there.
When you're improvising as a GM, how do you go about, when working with Shire or players, how do you go about drawing out more active engagement
Okay. The question is, when you're working with shyer players, how do you go about drawing out them to provide more active engagement for them?
I mentioned this on a panel yesterday. A lot of the kids that I work with have a lot of social anxiety. And so if I was to say to them as the game master, what do you do? That might be a little bit too much. Or tell me about your character's backstory. That might cause an anxiety response, which is the last thing we want, right? So what I've learned to do is ask closed questions. So in the context of like your backstory, I could say, is your character from a big city or a small town? Did that sword that they carry, was that given to them or did they buy it? And they can say, well, actually he found it. And they can gauge that sort of challenge by choice a little bit, and then over time they can build the comfort level of making up whatever they want to once they know it's safe, and you're not going to say his uncle gave it to him. That's stupid. Right? Who knows what this person's backstory is, the human being's backstory at the table is, around their attempts to come out of their shell and be vulnerable, and they want to make sure that the space is safe before they can do that. So there's my background is in drama therapy, and Jacob Moreno has this phrase that I love around, there's no such thing as resistance, it's just people who aren't warmed up yet. And so your job there is to just make sure they're warmed up and meet them where they're at and help them feel safe.
And if they don't feel like engaging with other PCs yet, make an NPC that would be like friendly for someone. But it could be just like an animal for them to like engage with, and so that way, because I know sometimes they're not ready to play with another character, especially if the other player character is very boisterous and very like, to ease them into like, so there's some interaction, and then maybe that boisterous character will gleam on that, like, oh, okay, and then they'll engage with them through maybe that NPC in that way. As a player, I've noticed that a lot with a couple of games I've played, and so my goal was like, ask a random question. It doesn't have to be related to whatever we're doing. It's like, hey, so like, how did you sleep last night in this inn? It's like kind of thing. So just like little things like that, so then that way they can like take their time and not force them to like engage with everybody.
Yeah, okay. Well, so that is the end of this panel. I don't want to speak for my fellow co-panelists, but I will be around at the show for quite a while today and a little bit tomorrow. Feel free to come up and talk and chat and ask your questions wherever you are. For the last few moments here, does anybody have anything that they would like to say in closing?
Game to Grow has a table here at OrcaCon down on the first floor, so if you want to come talk to myself or the other Adam Johns, we'll be there the rest of the weekend. So come find us also on our website at gametogrow.org and at GameToGrow on Twitter.
I'm about all weekend. I am more than happy to chat to anybody about anything, especially tea and gaming. So yeah, if you see me, I will happily answer questions or whatever you want.
Yeah, I'm on a panel about improvisation. I'm not shy. If you see me, talk to me, want to ask me questions about stuff, by all means, go nuts. If you want to do it in public space, I'm on Twitter almost all the time, much to my wife's chagrin, at the Mike Robles. Just find me. I like to talk about stuff.
Yeah, I'll be on the next panel and I'll be around. Today I'm GMing for most of tomorrow, but if you see me even after the con's over, I'm here until Monday. I'm free to talk, or on Twitter at Diana Moon. And check out I Need Diverse Games, INDG, on Twitch for our weekly POC cast.
Great. You can also find me on Twitter as well. I'm at Amanda Harmon. Thank you all so much for attending our panel, and we'll hope you have a great rest of the show.
We mentioned a lot of horror games. If you are interested in that, there's a horror panel happening.
At 1 o'clock in this room.
In this room.
With most of the same people.
Yes.